Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa. This is Rappler Talk. Joining us today is the US Ambassador to the Philippines, outgoing Ambassador to the Philippines, Philip Goldberg. Thanks so much for joining us,
Thanks,
Ambassador
Maria.
Goldberg.
Nice to be with you.
You came in with Yolanda or Typhoon Haiyan, and you are on your way out with Lawin Haima. I mean, you're coming in with storms and going out with storms.
Exactly.
This is a great time to talk to you, given that our president, Duterte, is in Beijing right now, and one of the biggest shifts, at least in the region, is this pivot of the Philippines from the United States to China. What do you make of this? How is the United States looking at this now?
Well, there are two different explanations for what the president is doing in China. One is the one you described, but another is that the Philippines is looking to have better relations with China, which is a good thing. It's something that we encourage. It's something that is good for the region. It's something that is good for the United States. You know, you have to remember, Maria, that the rebalance to Asia, the Obama administration's rebalance, was based on the idea that there's a rise of China, there's a rise of Southeast Asia economically, demographically, and that our future prosperity and our future generally is tied to this region. And that's the essence of the rebalance, but it's very much tied to China's rise as well. Correct. And the importance of China to all of us economically and in every other way. And so it's a good thing that the Philippines is having a better relationship with China, if that's how it turns out. But it shouldn't be at the expense of a longtime friend and ally in the United States, and that's what we're trying to maintain. And so I can't really judge fully what the landscape will look like until we know exactly what the Duterte government has in mind, because there are other voices that are saying this is just a way of improving relations with China. If that's what it is, it's a good thing, and it's an important step in trying to improve the regional atmosphere. But if it's something more than that, we'll have to see.
Well, we've certainly not seen rhetoric like this, the way President Duterte has addressed the United States or spoken about ties with the United States, at one point saying that the Philippines would consider stopping war games with the U.S. I mean, how has Washington reacted to that? How have you reacted to it?
Well, I think you're right. We've never heard language and that kind of rhetoric from a friend and ally, certainly. We have from other places, but not from a friend and ally. So it is something that we've taken note of, and we want to see what exactly the steps that follow will be, if there are any steps. We want to maintain an alliance and a friendship that has existed for 70 years, that's been very important for the Philippines' security, for United States security, for regional security. In fact, that very security alliance that we've had throughout the region, because it also involves Japan and South Korea and Australia, is what's allowed this region to become so prosperous economically and to progress, because it has had an underpinning of security. So we have to really figure this out. But you're quite right. The rhetoric that we've heard is something that causes a bit of head scratching and, quite frankly, a bit of concern in Washington, because we don't necessarily think this is something that is consistent with a friend and ally.
Well, better relations with China definitely benefits both of our countries, but the problem, of course, is China's own behavior. What we've seen through the past is many countries, including the Philippines and the United States, calling on China to observe the rule of law. It's part of the reason the old administration brought the South China Sea issue to The Hague. Do you expect China to behave any differently with President Duterte's new approach?
I think that what you mentioned, Maria, is very important, which is that the decision by the tribunal under the law of the sea is now international law, and it establishes international law. And we believe it should be observed as such by all the countries involved. We will continue doing what we have done in terms of freedom of navigation, in terms of protecting our interests and the interests of our allies. But what the Philippines does is obviously a sovereign decision of the Philippines. But we very much believe that the decision is to be followed, and all countries, including China and the Philippines, should recognize it as international law at this point.
If the Philippines were to pivot away from its long-standing relationship with the United States, closer to China and Russia, as President Duterte has said, what will that do for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, for geopolitics in Southeast Asia?
Again, it depends on what that change would be, and I'm not a tea leaf reader, and
Right.
I'm not into hypotheticals, as you know. But here's what we believe and what we would like to see go forward, which is that we've had an important security alliance. We have an important friendship. We share values. We share democratic practices. We have people-to-people ties that are really quite unusual in that the Filipino-American community is now the second largest Asian-American community. There are deep, deep family ties between the two countries. They're really unbreakable, these kinds of bonds. We have tremendous cooperation across the board, and it goes outside of the military and security area into the law enforcement area. It goes into business and commerce. The largest private employer in the Philippines is an American company. The largest exporter from the Philippines is an American company. We are, if not the largest foreign direct investor here, it's a very close call. We have a huge amount of companies that are interested here, and at the moment there's a concern that's being expressed about all of the things that you're talking about the rhetoric, about the concern about what's going on and whether the rule of law is being followed and so forth in the drug campaign.
In terms of, you mentioned the foreign direct FDIs, right? Coming in the last few months, we've seen an outflow of maybe $700 to $800 million US dollars. Is that correct?
There is a lot of hot money and the kinds of money that has gone into the market, and institutional investors, yes, I have heard, including in some very big companies that has been withdrawn, is what I hear. And so that's from various companies. I also hear that there are some investments that are being put on hold until the situation clarifies a bit. Because I think, as you point out, these are rather startling kinds of developments in terms of at least the expression of what could be. And business and people who invest want a certain amount of certainty. They're willing to take risks, obviously, because business is risk-taking. But uncertainty is not necessarily the friend of investment and of people who want to do business.
I mean, you could say this is a time of creative destruction for us, right? Headed there. You mentioned, well, actually, let me talk about ODAs, Overseas Development Assistance. During Typhoon Haiyan, Yolanda, the United States brought in a significant amount. Would you have an idea of how much the U.S. has brought in versus, say, China? To look at these two polarities right now.
I can talk to what the U.S. did, and we can allow China to talk about what it did. But the United States was one of the first countries on the scene to help, in part because we have these deep connections with the AFP, with the Armed Forces of the Philippines, with the Philippine National Police. We've trained together. We are very interoperable in that sense. And we did bring assets in almost immediately. I believe there were Marines on the scene with their AFP colleagues within 4 hours after the storm left the area. They helped reestablish the airport. They helped clear roads with their colleagues and counterparts. And that allowed relief to come in. And that was part of their regular training and things that we do together. I don't say this in the way of boasting or trying to take credit for something, because some people have said that's what we're trying to do, and I don't think that that's fair. But I think it is. It's a track record, and it's important to remember that it's part of what we train with the AFP and up to a point the PMP to do. So. In total, our contribution was about $143 million, but that includes some of the military costs as well. One of the things that I'm very proud of is that we didn't take our eye off the ball once the initial relief efforts had taken place. We've also been involved in some of the rebuilding efforts. I've been to Tacloban 5 times since. We've helped rebuild schools in Palo. We've, in Tacloban, done clinics, health clinics, and a tuberculosis clinic. We helped with American businesses, and I'm very pleased to say American businesses also pitched in to create new livelihoods in sari-sari stores, and so this was a total effort. When you think about the United States and the Philippines, you also have to remember it's not just government to government.
Correct.
There are all kinds of private initiatives, faith-based groups, and NGOs that mobilized also to help the Philippines. Millions of dollars raised in the United States because it was compelling that it was the Philippines, because the Philippines is an old friend, an ally. So that's the kind of relationship that we have, and that's what I think is important for everyone to take into account at the moment, because the discordant notes that we were talking about are really inconsistent with what people here, let alone in the United States, are thinking. Because if you look at the survey that came out day before yesterday, the SWS survey that showed an overwhelming majority of Filipinos have trust in the United States. Well, that trust has been built up over a long time. So that is compared against the voices that say, well, the U.S. hasn't been important or hasn't done certain things. And I don't think that's the way the people here, at least the people I deal with, feel.
Actually, 2 years ago, more Filipinos trusted the Americans than Americans trusted Americans. I don't know if you remember that
yes,
survey.
I do, and I can believe it.
Which was really interesting to me. So how would you describe the Philippines today?
Well, the Philippines is still a very good friend and ally of the U.S. We have a wonderful people-to-people relationship. We have very strong economic ties. In some ways, our bonds are unbreakable. But what we're waiting to see is what the effect of all of the rhetoric and the kinds of language and discussion, public discussion of what is coming next might be. We hope in what we can control, because on this side, a sovereign country can make the decisions that it wants to make about the relationship with the United States or with anyone else.
Right.
But from the United States point of view, we very much value the relationship with the Philippines and the alliance with the Philippines, and we want it to continue. That's why we are taking a very low-key approach. We're not taking all of this literally. We want to see how we can do this. I think it's important to have constructive conversations rather than just public discussions. There are items where maybe we could be more helpful to the Philippines. We've always discussed that with our Philippine friends in the government. And I'm afraid some of that's being lost, and we need to channel those things. I hear from all kinds of people, including President Duterte, that they want to maintain their alliances. Well, we would too, and but the kinds of things that we hear are not necessarily consistent with that. You know, it's not as though I don't listen and can't hear what's going on just as you do. In fact, it's because of you that I'm listening.
What about the negative aspects? I mean, if the Philippines were to continue, and President Duterte has actually been relatively consistent in terms of his own personal perspective before he ran for office while he was still mayor of Davao, and the country is headed in the direction that he set as early as October last year, where he said that he was going to shift the country away from the United States closer to China. And in his mind, it was because China is our neighbor, it's the largest country, he wanted to. So if the Philippines were to do something like this, how far is the United States going to go? Will we lose ODA? Will we, you know, I guess your words right now say that you're going to try to maintain it. But given a pivot, what are the repercussions of something like this?
We have to see what exactly that means before we can make decisions, and we'll make decisions also based on what happens here.
Got it.
I can't say now. It would be unfair to both countries to say. But as I mentioned before, it is not language or not charges or attacks that are consistent with the kind of relationship we've had or have at the moment and want to continue to have. If there are problems, let's discuss them, let's channel them. But that's the way I would put it.
You were personally on the receiving end of the rhetoric of President Duterte. How did you react? Personal attacks, right?
Well, I'm a diplomat. I'm not here on a personal adventure. I'm here representing my country. I'm here representing the President of the United States and the administration. And so I'm used to this. As a diplomat, you have to be, you're in the arena kind of.
You went through something like this in Latin America.
Yes, and you know, you just have to be ready for these things. But what I will say is that it's not necessarily me or anything that's said about me, but that in the U.S., when people hear that, they think about the Philippines and what they're thinking about the United States. And that's not a good thing, I think, for a friend and ally.
Yesterday, there was a protest outside the U.S. Embassy, and the video that came out of a police van driving directly into the protesters and driving back over it is violent. What was your reaction?
Well, it was disturbing, obviously, and we're sad that if people were injured and people were injured on the police side as well. There was some violence that was not associated with the van also, and paint thrown at the embassy, and we're grateful to the police for protecting the embassy. But I'm not aware of all of the details. If the police may be looking into it, I've seen some calls from the political leaders to look into it. The embassy is a diplomatic facility and needs to be protected, but at the same time, it's the Philippine National Police that protects the perimeter and the street and the flow of people and traffic, and follow what people are and are not allowed to do in terms of where they congregate. So I leave it to the government here to discuss. It's really not something that the United States was, except that they were protecting our facility.
Right. The Philippine National Police has taken action and put several of the people involved in that on administrative, taken them out of active duty. I guess part of what earned the ire of President Duterte for you is your outspokenness in terms of human rights. And since July until now, you're talking about nearly 4,000, if not more than 4,000 people killed in the drug war. The reaction of the United States, will you continue bringing this up as an issue, given that it's a hot button peg for the president?
Well, the United States clearly has a set of principles to which it adheres and voices around the world. It will always be the case. We represent our interests, but we also represent our values. And so rule of law and concerns about human rights will always be up there in terms of the interests and values that we represent. And so, yes, if there are issues to be discussed, yes, that will continue to be on the agenda. This is not just a question of not interfering in others' affairs. We have problems in the United States as well, and people look into those. People discuss them constantly, and that's the way it should be in a democracy if there are issues. And we all subscribe to universal principles, and especially two like-minded allies like the Philippines and the United States subscribe to certain universal values. And so if they come up, if there are things that we believe in, we have to discuss those things.
How would you describe the way official government policies have changed with the incoming administration?
I think you've put your finger on a lot of it. The tone appears to be different in many respects at the top, but at the working level in the cabinet, we still have very good relationships. We still are working very closely. You mentioned the counter-drug campaign, for example. You know, over the last few weeks, there have been 6 very large seizures at the airport, at NAIA, as a result of information provided by the DEA to their colleagues here. Because we have a network of international intelligence on drugs. We have something that no other country really has, and a coordinating function that no other country has. So we're helping the Philippines in that regard. We're helping the Philippines as it goes about the Philippine police as it builds a special boat unit in the south of the country, which helps not just with countering trafficking in persons or anti-poaching, but also on drugs. So there are a lot of things that we do that are not particularly known to the public, and I think they are appreciated as well. If we can change some of those things to better focus them on administration priorities, we always try to do that. It's not always the fastest process in the world. We're not a command kind of economy or government, and so we have to think these things through. And there have been questions raised about the whole process in the counter-drug campaign. So we have to be prepared. We have certain laws, certain obligations under U.S. Law to follow, and so it's the taxpayers' money, and we have to be careful with it.
Are you surprised by the change in the tenor of online discussions, for example? It's very interesting to me. I go back to the number of people killed in the drug war. The responses seem to be a 360-degree turn from a concern for human rights now to saying it's okay. It seeps through to our citizens. Is this a surprise to you?
I don't know whether it has surprised me. I know that drugs is a big issue here. I know that, at least anecdotally, that there are people who are feeling, perhaps in some of the poorer communities in Manila especially, are feeling maybe a little bit more secure as a result. But at the same time, there are problems associated with it, and that's what we've raised and some others around the world have raised. It's also created an image of the Philippines, and I don't know whether all the people who are commenting here fully appreciate how that comes across around the world. I don't control what the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Economist or anyone else has to say about this. And so they've played a very large role, too, in shaping the image of the new government and also what's going on in the counter-drug campaign. And, of course, politicians around the world react, and they listen to a lot of that as well. And it's natural. When you mentioned the incident at the embassy yesterday, you know that was on the 3 network newscasts in the United States, ABC, NBC, and CBS. The video was shocking, but it was also tied to anti-U.S., a kind of anti-U.S. riot. Now, you and I know the circumstances were different. They come and they demonstrate in front of the embassy regularly, the leftist militant groups. But this was a larger group than usual, and maybe that's because of some of the environment at the moment. But it's also the case that that's the image that's created, and it feeds on that. And you have to deal with the perceptions also. Right. And then if you add in some of the rhetoric and the rest, that's the impression that's created in Europe, in the United States, in many parts of the world.
There are many parallels between the United States and the Philippines right now in some ways. I mean, President Duterte's rise to power is fueled by the anger of the marginalized, right? Coming in, and this is legitimate anger, feeling left out of the system. The distrust of institutions. I've not seen as many conspiracy theories being booted around on social media as I have now. The distrust of institutions and governance of media. We're seeing this mirrored in the United States. Let me bring you to the United States. We just watched the third
I'm going
debate.
to the United
You're
States. You don't
headed
have to
there
bring
next
me.
week, right? Let's go there. And What do you make of what is going on? The great anger, the polarization of society, the kind of vitriol that you see both publicly and privately and on social media.
Well, I'm going to take off my diplomat's hat and put on my analyst hat, and still at the same time not take sides, because I'm not
You're not
supposed
supposed
to.
to. It would be great to.
I think what's going on in the United States is part of a global problem at the moment, especially in developed countries. I think what's going on here has a slightly different texture to it. In the United States, I think it's the case that globalization has resulted in dislocations. And there are a lot of people who feel that they've been left behind. The example I've heard used is of a factory worker who may have lost his or her job with good benefits and a pension, and now is driving an Uber cab and doesn't have that security and doesn't have the outlook on their future that they thought they had. So there's that economic piece. And there are great swaths of the Midwest and other parts of the country, the Rust Belt, that have particularly suffered that. At the same time, on the coasts, there's been a thriving under this global effect with high-tech and financial services and a transition that's been in some ways much easier.
Yeah.
So there's that economic impact. The second is because of increased immigration, because of a changing demographic in the country, there is some feeling in certain places that the cultural climate of the country is being changed. And so people feel that effect, and so there is a certain element of that. And the third is something that Rappler is expert in, which are technological changes. And that too is disorienting for certain people, especially older people who are not used to buying their groceries online, but used to going to the grocery store, or different kinds of impacts, or having an Uber app on your phone rather than calling the taxi company to come pick you up.
Right.
It may be more convenient, but it's just something they're not used to. So all of these things add up, and so I think that's, at least in the United States, or maybe with Brexit and some of the other Western developed countries, all of these things have added up into something that there is a certain call for political change. It also appeals to a certain kind of political response and politicians. So without going too far into that, I think that
anger spreads fastest online. So,
here I think, you know, there is some similarities, but it's really a different kind of situation.
This is an interesting question from Twitter. @DaveRealZ asks, between the U.S. presidential nominees of the two major parties, who do you think can stabilize U.S.-Philippine relations?
That's a good question. So much at the moment depends on decisions that will be taken here rather than in the United States. Clearly what I know, you know, I was an Assistant Secretary of State under Secretary Clinton at the State Department. And I do know that she has a very close relationship and a very good feeling about the Philippines. I don't know Mr. Trump, so I don't know so much. I know there's a Trump tower, I think, here in Manila, but I don't know as much. In our political system, and I can't say it would be the case this time, that there is more continuity in foreign policy than there is change, but that I can't say exactly, because a lot of that will depend on what happens here.
This is a question that has come up in numerous forums. Given where the rhetoric is taking us and where policy is shifting, how far would the United States go if things go bad with China?
Well, here's what I should have added at the end of that. I think anyone in the United States and the people of the United States want this relationship and alliance to continue and thrive. That's what we really are aiming to do. And so we think, and look, I understand this is 2016.
Right.
This is the 21st century, and there are 21st century interests and issues. This isn't the last century, the beginning or middle or end of the last century. We have a different relationship. People here talk about an independent foreign policy. I know that's enshrined in your Constitution. I never found in my dealings with the Aquino administration and now with the Duterte administration that it was anything but an independent foreign policy. Yes, we had a very close relationship.
Right.
Yes, we supported the Philippines' right to bring the case at the tribunal under the law of the sea. Yes, we do military exercises together, many of those exercises aimed at humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. I know people like to call them shorthand war games.
Right.
But they're training and professionalization and equipping and all kinds of things. So that's the kind of relationship that we'd like to keep going, but it's one based on equality, on respect for sovereignty, and I think that's what we've been doing. So this isn't the 20th century, it's the 21st century. We have new issues like climate change and very important issues that we need to focus on as a community of nations. It was because the United States and China came to a very important agreement on climate change that we were finally able to push through the Paris Agreement. These are important things, and we want to work together with all the countries involved. And this isn't some sort of return to the future. Well, it's hopefully creating a new future.
Other global issues, I mean, the security issues, cybersecurity. Let me ask you from a Philippine perspective here. What are the challenges ahead that you can see, security, economically, politically?
Well, there are a lot of challenges, but you know, I'm going to leave your challenges to the people here to describe. It's not for me to prescribe what the Philippines will face or should do, especially. I think what we're all facing in the world are challenges to democratic practices. We discussed the election in the United States or what's going on in Europe. You mentioned what was going on here.
Syria. ISIS.
There it's less a question of democratic practices than issues related to jihadism and how to deal with those.
Which you know
you have them here also. And one of the things of concern here, and I know it concerns your president, but it certainly concerns us as well, and where we have a common and shared interest, is to combat that phenomenon of radical jihadism and try to work with each other to do that. And that's what we've been doing for many years. We exchange information, we give assistance, we give intelligence support, logistical support over time. And I think those are all very important in dealing with a shared common interest, and so I hope those things continue as well.
President Duterte's pivot to China is not really all that new in terms of a policy or a strategy. We saw ASEAN, for example, this is in the 80s, the constructive engagement with Myanmar at that point. That didn't work then, and it was actually Myanmar itself, the change that brought about real change and diplomacy in this. In terms of constructive engagement, both the positive and negative, and I've thrown this to you in different ways, but how do you see the Philippines being affected by this now? If the Philippines were to shift closer to China, what is the worst we could expect from the United States? What is the best we could expect from China?
I hope that your relationship with China is a good one. I hope your relationship with the United States is a good one. I don't think this is a zero-sum game.
Agreed.
And if someone wants to make it a zero-sum game, then we probably will have disagreements and differences that could lead to a kind of divide between us. That's what I'm trying to prevent. I'm
You
not
know,
trying to encourage.
But in a way, the South China Sea issue has made it be that is a flashpoint, and it is a global flashpoint, right? Because so much trade passes through that.
Right.
Doesn't the Philippines then play a role in the shifting of the power balance?
The Philippines does play an important role in the security environment in the area. And the Philippines' interests in the South China Sea are important to us. I've described our interest in the South China Sea as twofold. One is one that is part of our own interest in maintaining freedom of navigation. It's important for all the countries in the region, but the United States is uniquely positioned to deal with that issue. But it's one that's also self-interested.
Yeah.
And the United States will continue to do that through freedom of navigation missions, through our dealings with China, and with all the countries in the region. But we've also, at some cost to our diplomatic relationship with China, tried to help the Philippines in defending it. China won't recognize the decision and
Right.
wasn't sympathetic to
Was
the
building
Philippines.
on several of the islands.
So,
right?
and has rejected the tribunal. So
And
it's
also
up to the Philippines to decide what it wants out of this. The public opinion polls that I've seen, and I don't mean to rely completely on public opinion polls, but it's one of the few points of empirically that we can discuss, is that the people here very much supported the decision to take that case to the tribunal.
Yes.
There was a great outpouring of satisfaction after the decision and pride, and so that is what we were helping support, in the sense that we didn't have claims in the South China Sea. We want those to be settled legally, diplomatically, through codes of conduct and all. And so that's up to the Philippines now, and the new president and his administration to decide, but that was the way the last government was going, and we were working closely with the last government.
The decision came 12 days after the
Right.
last government.
Well, I mean, it's one of those odd pieces of timing that may have caught a new administration, sort
By
of
surprise, right.
Well, it wasn't a surprise that it was going to happen,
Right.
but just how it's
was its
still
first.
getting organized, and that was one of the first things put on its plate.
You're leaving next week. Let me ask you some personal things. Your most memorable experience, your most fulfilling experience. What will you take home with you from the Philippines?
Well, there are all kinds of images in my mind that I will take with me, starting with the destruction that I saw at Leyte from Yolanda, but also the satisfaction of being a small part, quite frankly, of the effort to try to deal with it with our colleagues on the ground in the Philippines. And so that was the first of many images. The images of President Obama visiting 2 times and having him here 2 times, I think was something that I'll always remember. You have to remember, Maria, President Obama is our first African-American president. He's a source of great pride to so many of us, and not just because of the way, the civility and the way he deals with things, but also because of what it represents about our country. And so I'll always remember that. I'll remember signing the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA.
Right.
And being part of the end game of negotiations over it, because I think that's a very important agreement between our countries, one that helps the Philippines modernize and deal with many 21st century issues, including maritime security and having the ability to handle HADR more on its own, as well as for the United States as part of the rebalance to be more present in the region. So that I will have a mental image of that. And there are many other events. I'll always remember those events at Balitang, commemorating the events of World War II and fighting together with our Filipino allies and seeing some of those old soldiers on the Philippine side largely, and even a few Americans who would come, and fewer can come. Very meaningful. The events at the American Military Cemetery, where Filipinos and Americans are buried side by side. And that's very meaningful to me, as well as at Clark Cemetery, where it's mostly Filipinos in an American military cemetery. And this is what is meaningful to me as the American ambassador, and has been. It speaks so much about the relationship between our two countries and the modern relationship between our two countries, which was forged in World War II, which has developed since. It changed after the bases were closed. You know, what we're proposing now, I keep hearing some voices saying, you know, the American forces should leave the Philippines. We don't have many forces here. We have a few a small number in the South helping on the counterterrorism issue, but we're talking about EDCA locations and the rest. But that's not at issue, really. It's a question of working cooperatively in a friendly way, because we're two countries that have such close bonds. And those are the images. That's what I'll bring with me. There's one last point about it, Maria, and I've said it on a couple of other interviews, and I really mean it. I've served on 4 continents now. I have never met warmer and more friendly people than in this country. It is a wonderful feeling, the feeling towards Americans, the feeling to everybody, the welcoming that they give. And so I'll always bring that with me too. And it's important to remember, in all the hoopla about political events and geostrategy and the rest, that at bottom, the people of the two countries really, at this point, are so interconnected that that image of Filipinos and their friendship will stay with me as well.
The third aspect you mentioned when we were talking about U.S. elections are these technological changes, and I'm going to take it off of what you said, this warm feeling between it. I sometimes can't recognize the dialogue now on social media because of the great anger that is also there, that's been unleashed. And this is social media and democracy. We did a series that looked at this impact.
Well, I'm going to turn interviewer here for a moment. Was that the case 6 months ago?
It started, I would say it started about a year and a half ago, where, you know, there's always been anger. It's very easy to be a troll online because you're anonymous in many instances. So you don't have any of the inhibitions you would have in real life. So somebody can curse you. But in terms of becoming organized with a direct intent to try to stifle dissent of some sort or a different perspective, I think that's new for us, and we're seeing similar things happening in the United States.
That is actually the case in the U.S. as well. It's a little less the intimidation from social media, although that's part of it. I was reading yesterday in the New York Times that there's a good deal more of anti-Semitic chatter on different websites or in social media that hadn't been there before. And all of that's very disturbing. There are some violence at political rallies that we've had before, but you know, they were in the 19th century or early 20th century, not so much lately. So yes, I think that is a bit of a phenomenon that's happening around the world.
The technological change.
Yeah.
Well, we could talk more about this, but my last question is your successor.
Right.
What advice would you give to your successor, and what's the best way to deal with the Duterte administration if you're the U.S. ambassador?
Well, I'll maintain some diplomatic silence on some of what I'll advise him, but what I will tell him is that the Philippines is a friend of the United States. The people here are friends of the United States. They're wonderful people. And to keep that in mind as we go about crafting political solutions and military cooperation or assistance or all the things that we do. And that we will succeed in this, but that there are obviously going to be some bumps if, in fact, some of what we've heard of late is translated into decisions and policy. We haven't changed anything we're doing. We haven't really done anything to, quite frankly, engender any of this. So we're maintaining our programs and our friendship with the Philippines. And we'll do that if we can. But some of those things are going to be done here and not up to us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador
Thanks,
Goldberg.
Maria.
We've been speaking with Ambassador Goldberg, the outgoing U.S. Ambassador to the Philippines. He is on Twitter, @amgoldberg. Wish him well. He's leaving next week. I'm Maria Ressa. Thank you for joining us.